Hi, this is Dr. B, and in this video I will go over a few important things that you need to know to get started on your user guide project. All the slides that I'm using in this video are also posted to Canvas. Okay, so let's take a look here. For a more detailed breakdown of all of the sources and information in this presentation, you can click here and it'll take you to a really great online article that reviews different types of documentation for user guides in a lot of good detail and depth. Okay, we want to help a busy lay user to use a product or service or to complete a task or process with minimal frustration and risk. What I mean by this lay user is that essentially if someone's using a user guide, most of the time it's because they're not really sure what they're doing or not really sure how to use the product, or they don't know really how to complete the process. They might have different levels of expertise or familiarity, but most of the time, right, when we're using a user guide, it's because we don't really know how to do the thing. So this is someone that doesn't have a lot of expertise or a lot of familiarity, and they need to complete something very specific, and they're very goal oriented. And of course, we want to do this with minimal frustration, right? Nobody likes trying to follow instructions or use a new product and get sidelined because, they're frustrated. And in order to achieve these goals, we also have to think about producing not just a user guide in terms of content, but we have to also think about producing good technical communication, right? So the goals of technical communication in general are to help a busy reader to make a decision or take an action. So all the skills that we're practicing in this class, to help us create good technical writing are also going to help us create effective user guides. So let's think about what makes a good user guide. You have most likely been a user in your life of some sort of product, service, or guide, and I'm sure that all of us have a lot of familiarity with trying to use things like instructions, tutorials, and other forms of documentation. And I think all of us kind of intuitively as readers know what makes a good guide or a not very good guide. The thing is we have to kind of flip our thinking now. We don't want to make decisions about our user guide based on just instinctual experience as a user. We want to really think about these things purposefully and mindfully now as a writer and a designer. So in general, these are the components that make a good user guide. But depending on the type of user guide, these can be sort of swapped in and out. So in general, we want to have some relevant background information, right? We'll take a look at what I mean by this in a minute, but we don't normally just jump in and start doing stuff, right? We need to know, what do we need to know before we even get started? What kind of skills do we need to have? What sort of tools do we need? Obviously, we want to know what the features of the product or the service even are. We want kind of a quick explanation or overview of the process that we're about to undertake. If we are about to commit some time of our day and our energy, most of us don't just get started to see what would happen. We kind of have to plan for that. We want to really think ahead and go, okay, can I do this in an hour? So a really good user guide is going to kind of give us this overview of what's about to happen before they jump in and do it. And also a good user guide is going to anticipate user problems. Part of this is familiarity with what you're doing. So as you're building your prototype, I want you to take note of when you have issues. When we're doing usability testing later, you're going to try to capture the questions and frustrations of the people who are testing your guide. And you can also do some secondary research online for similar instructions or similar projects online and read comments and things like that. We'll talk about research in a little bit, but so some of this anticipating user problems is going to be your own experience, and some of it's going to be, through research. A good user guide is also mindful of the user's context or situation of use. Too many really horrible user guides out there are super generic, and the fact is they don't really think about the situation in which the user is using them. So is this person in a laboratory? No. Is this person going to be in a place where they have unlimited access to all the tools? No. Think about where they're really using this guide. So a great example of this is one time I had someone write a user guide on how to change your tire. And for some reason, they developed it as a PowerPoint presentation. And the content was really good, but I had to remind this person that, if you're by the side of the road in the middle of the night and your tire has blown out, you're probably not going to get your computer out and look up a PowerPoint presentation. So we really do want to think about the situation in which our users are using this guide. A good user guide will also have like additional information other than just the nuts and bolts of what you're doing, right? They'll have tips and tricks and resources. So you really do want to think about your user and do your research so that you can give them the kinds of content that they need. And a lot of this stuff is choose your own adventure, right? Maybe one user isn't going to use all of this content, but a good user guide is written to a variety of learning styles and a variety of different people with different levels of expertise, with limits, of course. A good user guide is also going to have some sort of awareness of the potential hazards. It's our job to protect our users and to keep them safe. So it's our job to anticipate possible dangers and make sure that we're informing our user how to protect themselves. A good user guide is also going to reflect the user's goals and motivations. So many user guides are horrible because none of us want to use them because they don't reflect what we're really trying to do. So if you want to play a really fun video game, you're not going to want to read a PDF, right? So think about not just the content, but the delivery of your guide and how it can really capture, again, the goals and motivations and, of your user and make it engaging and interesting. If something is engaging and interesting, people are more likely to use it. Okay, so remember the features of a technical document. You can come back and look at these slides that we talked about earlier in the semester. Everything that we're doing this year should have these features. Now, what these features look like are going to differ depending on the document. So this might look different in a troubleshooting guide than it would instructions. It might look different in a PDF than it will in a PowerPoint presentation. It might look different in a video than a written document, but we really are practicing this. So I want you to come back and really be mindful about how you're going to implement these features in your user guide. So there are different types of documentation. Again, that source at the very beginning, if you click on that, it will go over all the basics in a lot of depth. And I'm sure that you're familiar with different types of documentation, and you can really get creative. I mean, you can invent a new type of documentation. You can meld different kinds of genres into something new, as long as it's something that's helpful to your user, captures their motivation, thinks about their situation of use, has good design. There's a lot of things that you could really do. But in general, these are the basic kinds that I want you to think about, and you choose which ones you think will be the most useful for your user. Now, the assignment description has some basic things you have to include, but you can also get creative, like I said, and the more documentation you include, the more likely you are to produce a really excellent assignment, which of course is an A. So a quick start or reference guides are a type of documentation. Instructions, recipes, and tutorials are another group. Troubleshooting guides are another form. And then finally we have FAQs. These are just really basic components, and when I say user guide, what I usually mean is a combination of these things. A really good comprehensive user guide is not just a set of instructions or just a YouTube tutorial, but they'll have different components of these kind of mixed together. And this is the type of documentation. It doesn't really entail how it's supposed to look. So for example, a troubleshooting guide can be an infographic. It could be a text document, it could be a web page, it could be a video. Same thing with any of these other documentations. So this is more about the genre, right? Or the purpose, the goal, and the general rules and organization of this content, but it's not necessarily the delivery format, which we'll talk about later. So for each one of these different types of components of a user guide, I give you a kind of overview in these slides, so for example, a quick start or reference guide is really just a Cliff Notes version of a full user manual. It might be something that you produce after writing the full user guide. You might then have like a quick cheat sheet or get started guide that someone could hang up, so as an infographic or a poster or something. And for each one of these, I also give you some examples that you can go take a look at. We've all seen instructions before. There are really good instructions and there are really bad instructions. I give you a few examples here of different kinds of instructions that you can look at. Of course, recipes are a type of instruction. A tutorial video is a type of instructions as well. Usually what this is doing is it's breaking something down, into a process, into a series of tasks. or steps, they're usually organized chronologically, right? Because we want to start the process and we want to finish the process. But even within those steps, or you can group them into phases, for example, depending on how complex it is. These are really designed to be used in real time. Other forms of documentation are not necessarily intended to be used in real time as the user is performing the task, but this type definitely is. So there are different kinds of challenges to really good instructions than there are to maybe a troubleshooting guide or a quick reference guide. Okay, troubleshooting guides are companions to instructions. They're very different than an FAQ, although sometimes people get them confused. So a troubleshooting guide is really capturing the real life user's experience and frustrations and environmental things that can cause problems with following the process. So sometimes with troubleshooting guides, you can collect this information using usability testing, but you can also do some secondary research. But the idea is that a user is following a process, and at some point during that process, a problem happens and the process is interrupted. This problem might be, a common design flaw. It might be a lack of skill or expertise on your user's, part. It might be that something is unclear in the way you've written the instructions, or it might be something in the environment, but something has happened to stop the process, and the user cannot get back to the process until I've solved that problem. And so that's what the troubleshooting guide does. It anticipates these common issues, and it helps the user quickly and easily get back to what they were doing. Okay, and here I list some troubleshooting examples, and we'll take a look at some of these later. A process explanation is similar to instructions if you're not used to reading them, but while an instruction isn't designed to be carried out in real time, step by step, sometimes in other forms of documentation we still have to explain a process, but we're not necessarily expecting our user to follow that process in real time. And so there are times when we use a step-by-step instruction, and times we might just describe something using a process explanation. An FAQ sometimes seems similar to a troubleshooting guide, but an FAQ, think of it more like background information or knowledge. Someone might consult an FAQ before they get started on a process, but this is really more informational. So while a troubleshooting guide helps users complete a task once an error has occurred, an FAQ tries to give them some context, some background information to educate or inform them, or point them to other resources if maybe the solution's outside the scope of the actual guide. And I do give you some examples of FAQs. Okay, some tips for user guides. A user guide is typically a combination of documentation. Remember that good user guides are practical in that they enable users to perform work, but they're also educational. They teach relevant concepts and skills. So sometimes when we complete a process, we have learned a new skill that we didn't anticipate, or maybe we just have more familiarity with certain types of tools. And a good user guide is going to sow the seeds of its own destruction. So a really good user guide is not going to be needed in the future. If you've done your job as a technical writer, hopefully they won't have to keep coming back to the user guide to complete whatever the process is, right? Now, delivery of these types of guides come in a lot of different forms, right? You can just write each one of these up as a text document, but you can also create infographics, video tutorials, web pages. There's a lot you can do. You can even combine different of these kinds of elements to create a guide. Really, when you're thinking about delivery, we want to think about who is our user and what are they used to interfacing with, and also what's their situation of use, what delivery format's going to be really convenient for them, and what's more engaging. Some people really love video tutorials, and some people really love infographics, and some people just want a text document. So think about who your user is and how they learn effectively, and think about what might be the best delivery form. But don't confuse delivery with genre. So an instruction can be a text document, infographic, or a video. So it's not that instructions have to be a text document. And then I also include a lot of tips in this presentation that you can review later for how to create really effective user guides. So come back and check these out when you get a chance. And in user experience and usability, we develop user personas, and these user personas help us to understand what our users need, not just in terms of content, but also in terms of design and delivery. And user personas are based on some form of research. We don't just sort of make up this information, but we actually go and try to research it and develop fact-based, evidence-based tips and practices for ourselves. Okay, so a user persona is, an artificial construct. If you look at different examples of user personas, some of them are kind of corny because they'll actually like have a fake picture and a fake name, and they really are, it's a tool. They're really trying to get you to use it as a tool to really empathize with your user and really think of them as a real person. But really, a user persona is an artificial construct that stands in or represents a group of people. And so depending on how diverse our set of users are, we actually might need more than one user persona. But in general, these are the things we want to kind of think about when we're starting to develop our user persona, which is like demographic information. So we want to choose very relevant demographic information to represent our user and that we can actually research to help us understand them. We also want to try to capture their values and motivations and goals. So sometimes we focus too much on what we want to accomplish as writers, but a good user guide, just like good technical communication, aligns with our users' situation of use, aligns with their goals and their motivations for using our documentation. And of course, the situation of use. We want to think about where are they actually using this and what might be some aspects of those environment that we want to think about when we're designing. Like I said, sometimes one user profile is not enough. We might actually have to develop more than one, depending on how diverse and how broad our user base is. And just remember that this is a research tool, and yes, it can be helpful to empathize with our user, but it's not an actual person. So sometimes we get too attached to these user personas, we can start stereotyping people, and that's really dangerous. Just remember that if you're going to include some information in your user profile, it's evidence-based. You've actually done some form of research to come up with that information. Okay, so we've looked at the Easy Bake Oven, for example, previously in the class, and we talked about the different users that are probably using not just the product, but the documentation. And so we talked about how these different design elements, so for example, the photos, and breaking down the steps and kind of organizing it based on this wheel. We really broke it down in class. We linked those to the clear aspects of our user personas, and we talked about how different design elements might be better for younger kids versus older kids, and certain design elements might be useful for older adults. So the idea is that this document can be useful for a few different types of or groups of users, and that's not by accident. Someone actually sat down and sort of broke down the personas and their needs, and then thought strategically about how these design elements could help those users. So things to think about: not every user persona is going to have the same type of information. Sometimes age group is important and sometimes it's not, right? For example, if you're designing to WSU college students, age might not be a huge factor most of the time, but it might. It just sort of depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Situational factors are, almost always going to be important. Goals and motivation are important because it does no good to actually write a user guide if no one's going to use it. So there are a lot of different things that you can think about when developing your user persona. We also can learn from our users. One of the things that sets technical communication kind of apart from other forms of writing is that we go and ask our users for their input. This is one of the reasons why we're doing usability testing in class, is that we can actually understand our users' attitudes, our users' perceptions, and their frustrations. So there's nothing wrong with actually going out and talking to, for example, WSU undergrads and try to understand what would be their motivation for upcycling, or what would be some of their motivations or goals in recycling plastic, or do they even care? Do we have to make them care before we can give them the guide? So actually going out and talking to users, can help us a lot. So there's a really wonderful, so one of my favorite bad examples that I have used in the past as really terrible instructions is called the Dig and Jump Start Trampoline. Now it's hard to find nowadays on the interweb, but it was a really terrible set of instructions that was really, really poorly designed. And I wanted to show you this because when I was actually trying to put together this awful trampoline, I had to go look for information online because the instructions were so bad. So one of the places I found some really cool comments about this, not just the product, but the guide itself, was on Amazon. And some of these were really hilarious. If you've ever read, Amazon comments, sometimes they're really funny, but that doesn't mean that they're not helpful. So obviously a lot of other people had the same frustrations that I did when I was trying to put this thing together. And it's not about the product itself. It wasn't that it was a badly designed product. It was the documentation. The documentation was really terrible. But I found someone who shared her experience of how to put it together. And so it was actually really helpful. This is a good example of where we can kind of go to research our users and their needs and their frustrations, and to research content. I mean, you don't have to come up with everything on your own. I mean, obviously you want a site where you've borrowed information, but going and talking to your users or researching your users and what they're talking about can help you create a good guide. Even if you don't have direct access to those people. Like, let's say you're designing for military moms, but you don't have any military moms around to go talk to, go online, look up Reddit forums, look up Amazon comments, watch people's YouTube vlogs, go on TikTok. I don't know, find out where they're posting and talking online, and you can learn a lot about your users from your users. Okay, so you'll need to develop some sort of user persona in order to write an effective guide. It's not that you're going to include the user persona as a piece of the documentation, but if you want to design a really good user persona, this is some of that sort of prior background work you're going to have to do. And it will also save you a lot of heartache and trouble because it will help dictate your decisions. So I offer some resources here. You can click on these links to learn more about user personas if you'd like. The last thing I wanted to talk about is doing some research for your user guides. I've mentioned in the prior two sets of slides a lot about how we don't want to just make assumptions, and we don't just have to make up everything on our own. That it saves us a lot of heartache and a lot of work to just go out there and do some actual research. So there are different ways that you can do research for your guides. Essentially, think about it this way. We don't always encounter all the problems or questions that our users do. While you're creating this prototype, you just might not encounter all the problems. Or when someone else in class is usability testing, they might not encounter all the problems. So just because 5 people in class didn't have a problem doesn't mean that other users out there wouldn't. So doing some research helps you to understand what are the different problems and frustrations that your users will have, so you can create and design really good documentation. Also, sometimes we need to give our users additional information, but we don't have to give them all that ourselves. For example, if my user doesn't understand how to use a Phillips head screwdriver, I don't necessarily have to include that in my instructions. Myself, I don't have to create that content, but I can go find some really good resources and point them to those resources. So there are various ways or reasons why we would use research. Just think about the information needs, not just of yourself. You definitely have information needs as a writer and a designer, but your users themselves are going to have information needs. So there are various reasons why you might want to use some sort of secondary research in developing your user guides. For example, you might want to provide background information. You might need to define something. If you're creating a really engaging tutorial, you might want to include a story or an anecdote. There are going to be times you're going to need to provide specific details, and they can be hard to just randomly come up with details. So using sources can help us fill those out. There are a lot of reasons we might do this. You might also need to synthesize solutions from various sources, or collect information up from across different places. Let's say you found some issues on Reddit, while the comments of an Amazon product and a comment on a YouTube video. Synthesizing that helps you to create content. So you do want to cite sources when you use them, but you can also use that as a foundation for your own creative process. Okay, but the most important reason that we actually use research and technical writing is to understand our users. So even if you don't feel like you need to conduct research to help people, create rope or something out of plastic bags or something, you do need to do some research to understand who your users are so you can develop a really good user profile that's going to help you develop really good documentation. Okay, so our job as writers and designers is to understand the problem and to understand our users' needs, to locate information that will help solve our users' problem, and then synthesize that information into a usable and accessible document. And sometimes we have to get help to do that. We can't do everything ourselves. We can't know everything ourselves, and that's why we use research. All right, so there's different types of research. In general, primary research is the type of research that you do, and secondary is the kind that other people have done and that you're, relying on that information. So types of primary research are things like interviews or surveys or focus groups, prototyping, usability testing. Secondary research can be like conducting a literature review, just reading anything that's existing online that's already a source. So like existing guides or reading forum posts or blog articles or something like that. So there's different ways that you'll use sources for this user guide. You might have to do research and use sources to help you satisfy your own information needs and the needs of your user, but you can also find really good sources online to provide as resources for your user. You don't have to educate them on everything. Sometimes they're going to have information needs that are outside the scope of what you can do, but if you have vetted some really good resources for them, you can provide that information to them by linking to these other resources. Okay, so how can we apply this to your user guide? There's different ways that you can use research for your user guide. It can help you to generate content, like I've talked about, help you understand problems so that you can, help create maybe a really good FAQ or a really good troubleshooting guide. It can help you understand your users' needs so that you can better design for them. It can help you determine the scope of your guide. If you've researched other guides, it can help you understand what's out there and what's not. What is the gap maybe that your guide needs to fill? And that can help you, with the scope of your own project or with coming up with something really creative. And I have some tips down here that takes you to a website by iFixit that gives you some further ideas for how you can use online research to help you write a guide. In this instance, specifically a troubleshooting guide, but it really does apply for all types of documentation. Okay, and we also want to provide resources for our users. So if you feel like they need more information, maybe they need some background information or develop a skill, before they can use your guide, or if you think they might be interested in elaborating on something, but it's outside the scope of your guide, you can provide a resource for that. Perhaps there's a multi-phase process and one of those phases is just too complicated to include in your guide or is outside the scope of your guide, you can link to another resource that covers that. Again, additional help, maybe there's some other really good information out there that you found and you were using some of that while developing your guide and you think would be a really great resource if someone wanted to learn more. And again, one of the reasons that we do this is that our users start to trust us and get to know us, and they can feel overwhelmed when researching themselves online. They don't know what to trust, right? So if they trust us, then they're more likely to want to read what we think is valuable. So people want those credible sources that have been vetted by people they trust. Okay, and just remember that even though, in real life you do cite sources, it's more of a concern, obviously, in academic writing. There are a lot of ways to cite your sources. In the end, it really doesn't matter which sort of citation guide you use. You have to think about your user. You have to think about their situation of use. If you're writing to a fellow academic, you're going to use an academic, citation guide. If you're writing a large text document online for a busy public reader, you're probably going to use EndNotes. And if you're using something interactive online, you can probably just link to it. So it's not really so much about the right way of citing, it's that cite when you should, and cite in the way that your user expects and that is least frustrating for them. Okay, so that was a lot of information. There's a lot of details in these slides. There are links to other resources. So please dive in. And if you have any specific questions, reach out. I'm happy to discuss examples in class. I'm happy to come by and give you some feedback. And of course, you're always welcome to come by my office and bring what you're working on and ask for feedback there. That's it. Have a good one.